Okay, we're a few minutes past, so we're going to get started. And we are just a tiny bit more late today because we had a small technical problem, which never happens. So here we are at the very end, experiencing that for the first time. So I guess we're lucky in that way. So we are so happy today to have Dr. Karen Snedker, who we are also happy to have Dr. Amy Bailey, who will be doing the introducing. And if you recall, Dr. Bailey is the former CSDE chair, so we're very happy to see her here today. So I'll just tell you, for those of you who don't already know Amy, that she's an associate professor at the University of Illinois, Chicago in the Department of Sociology. And since we're a little late, I'm going to hand it right off, but I will just remind everyone, please use the Q&A, put your questions in there directly as you think of them, or just say you have a question, and at the end we'll go through those together, and I can actually unmute you. So we would love to hear from you directly. So please do talk to the speaker and have a nice back and forth conversation. So with that, Amy, thanks again.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Maria. This is a real pleasure and honor. So Karen Snedker is a professor of sociology at Seattle Pacific University, where she has been on faculty since 2006. She's also a clinical assistant professor in the University of Washington School of Nursing, a faculty affiliate in the sociology department here at UW, and a research affiliate at CSDE. And in addition to her extensive body of published work on homelessness, which has been covered in national and regional outlets, including the New York Times, the Seattle Times, also appeared in pieces that she's written for The Conversation and the Chronicle of Higher Education. Professor Snedker also studies violence, fear, neighborhoods, the criminal justice system, and mental health, among other interrelated topics. And her 2018 book titled Therapeutic Justice, Crime, Treatment, Courts, and Mental Illness combines many of these strands of research. I would, of course, be remiss if I didn't mention perhaps one of Karen and my both most humbling scholarly achievements, which took place around 15 years ago. We showed up at a conference panel to present our co-authored paper, had not consulted with each other in advance, and were wearing exactly the same outfit. We had black boots, black pencil skirts, white blouses, and gray cardigan sweaters. So go team. So luckily for me on that day, and fortunately for us all here today, Karen is an outstanding presenter, and her scholarship is frankly exceptional. So her talk today is titled Tents in Seattle, Sanctioned and Unsanctioned Tent Encampments. So please join me in welcoming Karen Snedker.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bailey, for that lovely introduction. And I would be remiss if I didn't also highlight that presentation, where we were dressed rather like twins, did result in our AJS piece, which is actually 10 years ago, almost to the day. So what a wonderful day to celebrate and to be connected together around important work that we've done together. Today, I'm going to talk about tents. So I'm going to share my screen. And what I want to talk about today are tents. And I want to talk about tents in Seattle. And I'm really drawing from two different sources of data that I've collected over time. One on unsanctioned tents, particularly coming from a most recent tent census that I'm going to talk a lot about today. And the second coming from some research I've done when a sanctioned tent encampment at Tent City 3 was on our campus here at SPU. So I'm really trying to pull together some data on tents from two different perspectives and two different kinds of data sources: quantitative on the one hand with the tent census, and more qualitative on the other hand with interview data from Tent City residents. And I do this for many reasons. I've had a long interest in tents. I think tents are an important part of visible homelessness that often get seen from a singular perspective. And what I want to do today is think about them a little bit more in a more complex way. So let me take a step back before we think just about tents and think about homelessness in King County in Seattle. And we only have data from 2020, as many of you know, because of the coronavirus pandemic and the health issues around collecting data. So we have this is the best data that we have from the point in time counts in January of not this year, but of last year. But what I want to talk about today is unsheltered homelessness. And so if you look at this data from last year, almost 12,000 people were found to be experiencing homeless on a given night in January. And 47% of those were unsheltered. Now, this is important and interesting for lots of reasons, but it's important for you to note that this kind of goes up and down. And in 2018, this number was even higher. It was higher, over 50%. So it's important to note that it hovers that half of the homeless population in our region. I'm going to come back to this later, but as you see from the general data from King County, people who are homeless in Seattle are disproportionately male, higher percentage of LGBTQ plus IA community, very racially diverse and disproportionate for many racial and ethnic minorities. And we'll come back to think about that as we compare to some data that I have from some sanctioned tent encampments. So first I want to talk about unsheltered homelessness. And it really means lots of different things. It means people living on the streets, in abandoned buildings and public places, lots of vehicular homelessness, people living in RVs, and also includes a little bit more structured unsheltered homelessness in things like tiny house villages. So those are all part of unsheltered, and they're all important and interesting, and people are doing really good research on those. But what I want to talk to you about today are tents. And I want to complicate tents a little bit. And I want to think about 3 different classifications. I want to think about, we need to understand tent homelessness by looking at those that are on their own, that is solitary tents versus clusters in groups. And then we want to think about different types of groups. But we also want to think about those that are usually sanctioned, that is, have a legal mandate or even just legal recognition to be clustered together, and those that are largely unsanctioned, that is, without that legal oversight. And then I want to think about those that are clustered in another way. I want to think about those that are self-managed versus some other kind of management. Now, that other kind of management could also mean not managed. That is unsanctioned, clustered, without any kind of structure or organization. We can also think about other kinds of management around city management or management by a nonprofit organization. So I just want you to be thinking, as I talk about tents, about these different classifications and components, because they think that together, if we break tents down by some of these features, we'll get a much bigger picture, a more holistic pictures of tents as a part of our understanding of homelessness. So if we look at that same data from King County, here's what I'm mostly talking about. For the first half of the talk, I'm going to be talking about this 10% number from 2020, tents that are unsanctioned for the most part. But then I'm going to complicate things a little bit and talk about this sanctioned encampment component, not so about the tiny villages, but about thinking about places like Tent City 3. So just to give you an overview, this is a sizable, but not by any means the largest category of unsheltered homelessness, and certainly not the largest category of homelessness in general. That would be emergency shelters, and for unsheltered, that would be people living in vehicles. So it's an important part, but it is not the largest segment of the homeless population. So let's talk tents. I want to start by, why did I start?
I'm sorry, we've got a quick question. If you could
sure.
Explain the difference between tents and sleeping on the street or outside.
Great question. So if you're sleeping on the street or outside under a bridge somewhere without any kind of tent structure, then you're going to fall into that street outside group. But if you have a tent, and we also counted tent-like structures, things that were acting as tents, then you're going to get counted in the tent unsanctioned encampment. So really it is about the physical tent. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's talk tents. I want to start by sharing with you why I decided to conduct a tent census and why do this systematic tent inventory. And the motivation really has been brewing for years. And it really started in 2017 when Tim Burgess put out a memo when he was interim mayor that said there were 400 unsanctioned tent encampments in the city of Seattle. I looked and looked and looked to try to find more, dig deeper. Where did this come from? What was the methodology? How do they define an encampment? Is that all clusters, or were singular tents also included? How big does an encampment have to be? You here are demographers who think of these methodological questions all the time. So these are going through my mind for years, and I can't find any great explanations. The best explanation I received from city officials was that this number came from the customer service requests, that is complaints to the city, find it, fix it, and those kinds of data sources that they accumulated together. But it was clear that there wasn't good, they weren't that confident in this number themselves. And although it's used in media all the time, Seattle Times, NPR, lots of news sources, most people in doing homelessness work or in city government know that it's not really a point of comparison. So it's not really a great piece of data. So we have this number out there in the public, but we don't really know how accurate it is. So I've been bemoaning this for quite a few years. And those of you who know my husband will know that if you bemoan something and complain about something for a while, he will help you towards a solution. So one morning over breakfast, I said something about how many tents are there really? Because everybody was telling me they're going up. And he said, if you want to know how many tents there are, why don't you count them? So I said, you know what? I'm going to go back to the old fashioned shoe leather, boots on the ground. This is how we do it. We go and collect data. If the data isn't there in the data set, we go and we get it. And so that's what I decided to do. So how did I do this? I did this with a team of 6 undergraduate students. And we used both low tech and high tech. The low tech was a physical map that we highlighted as we went along to different parts of the city. And of course, we used our phone to pin, to geocode each location. Now, I want to remind you that the unit here, the unit of analysis here is a tent, not an individual. There were no exchanges. We stayed far away from people, were respectful, and we were really just looking at the structures. So what did we actually do? Well, between April and August, we actually conducted a full census, which I'm calling Wave 1. And I'll show you some of the results in a moment. But it was clear, it was probably clear before we did this, but even more clear once we started to look at the data that they were clustered. And so what I wanted to know is, well, maybe we should go again and get some additional data, some additional waves. But it didn't make sense to do the entire city because it was very time consuming. And a lot of places didn't have any tents. So what I decided to do was resample the highly populated areas from the first full census. And so in doing so, later in that year, during fall and winter, we conducted a second wave. And this was just with 2 students from that original group. And then, of course, we all know that our lives changed dramatically in March of the next year. And I was hearing a lot of researchers and policy makers and practitioners really worrying about what COVID was going to do around homelessness. So I decided, well, let's do it again. We know how to do this now. We're getting faster, as you can see, as we go along, because we learned how to do this work a lot more efficiently as we went through. So we did a third wave, or a second of the resample in July, in over 2 weeks in July. So that's sort of what we did. And now let's think about what we found. So I'm going to show you some pictorial representations of some of these findings, but I just want to give you the overview because I think it's nice to give a big picture first. So first finding, there are a lot of tents. Probably you didn't need a tent census to tell you that if you live in Seattle. You're seeing them kind of in your daily lives, many of you. We found about 839 tents in the city of Seattle. And if we use the multiplier that King County uses for their point in time estimate, which is a 1.5 person per tent multiplier, we come up with about 1,257 people who are captured in our tent census. Now, that's very similar to the 1,205 number that you would get from looking at the point in time estimate that King County puts out. But keep in mind, this is just the city of Seattle and not the entire metropolitan region. And while we might expect that most of those will be, or a disproportionate amount of those will be in Seattle, it seems that there's probably quite some undercounting in the point in time estimate, at least in terms of tents. So lots of tents. Second, they are largely in unsanctioned clusters, which we also probably knew. Our research team also went to the 9 tiny house villages and Tent City 3 to collect data on how many people were living there during this 2019 tent census, and it was about 320. So if you compare that 1,250 to 320 number, we really see that this is largely those that are not in these sanctioned environments, and they are clustered together. And I'll show you some data in a moment of those clusters. Not surprisingly, there are clear spatial patterns to where we see tents and where we don't see tents. And I'll show you in a minute with the actual maps as we break the city down into north, south, and north, central, and south. The majority of the tents are in the central, central and south part of the city, less of it in the northern sections. So I'll give you some data on that in a moment. But there really are spatial patterns to where tents are, and importantly, where tents are not, right? Where tents are not. And lastly, I wanted to get a sense of if this is changing, and albeit with some limitations that I'll talk about in a moment, there does seem to be some increases. So I'm going to give you some numbers around these increases. So first, let me show you one of the interesting findings, that the encampments are largely not solitary. I mean, the tents are largely not solitary. That is, they're in encampments. But those encampments are not as large as I think sometimes the public might expect. So what we found was that of those 839 tents, 178 of them were isolated. We couldn't see them connected to any other tents. But 661 we logged as being connected to other tents, really close by. And that of those 661 tents, those were put into 132 encampments, with the average size of the encampment about 4 to 5 tents. But as you can see from this graph, there were 11 encampments with a lot of tents, 10 or more tents. So I think this is important for us to know what the size is of some of these encampments. So that's something on the size. Let's look at the visual maps. And I have to say in the very beginning here, I have Chuck of UW to thank for these wonderful maps and illustrations in helping me to put this into GIS and into a visual format. So thank you to him for that important assistance. So if you look at the left panel, this is the full tent census. And what we can see here is there's clear clusters. And you can probably even visually tell that the numbers of tents are smaller in the north section than they are in the central, which includes downtown, or the south section of the city. And those of you who really want to know numbers, we counted 192 in the north, 265 in central, and 382 in the south section as defined by the city clerk's office. But but you can see there's clear clusters. There's clusters in Ballard in the northern section, and there are clusters along I-5, 99, I-90, 509. So what we know from research on homelessness is not surprising here, that we find them are in parks and around freeways and other kinds of intersections and bridges. So now let's look at the resample in October to December and then in July. And you can even visually see that they've increased just because you can see the size of those dots have gone up. So to give you two examples, if we compare the census to the resample 1 and 2 in Ballard, in the full census, we only counted 159 tents. In the first resample, we only counted 106, and in the second, 261. So that gives you a sense of, in Ballard, what we saw. Same comparison for downtown. In the full census, it was 65, then we only found 14, and in the third, the final resample, 83. So we do have some evidence that we see this increasing. Now there's some limitations here that I'm sure you're fully aware of and will push me on, but let me just identify a couple for us that we've been thinking about. One, the big issue is time here. It was different units of time to do this work. There's lots of reasons for that, mostly very little funding and working with students on a sort of mentorship project as well as a research project at the same time. Second, nobody had done this before, at least not that I was aware of. So there was no clear blueprint of how to actually do this. So we did get faster and more efficient over time. Another limitation is there weren't that many tents in Green Lake in 2019. So it wasn't included, big mistake, wasn't included in our high sample repopulated areas for our final 2 waves. That's something I clearly wish now, especially with given the proliferation, the visual proliferation of tents and the public outcry about them. I wish I had had some data on that. Likewise, the chop zone, a part of the protests were not a part of the resample, which would have been also sort of some interesting data to have. So those are some of the big findings. There's lots of them. They're clustered. They're largely in groups, and they're not in tiny house villages. They're not in tent cities. They are not sanctioned. So that's something about unsanctioned tents that I wanted to share and think about. But my interest is really tents much more broadly. So I thought it would be interesting to juxtapose data just on how many tents are there to a case study of looking at one sanctioned tent encampment and something about the lives of the people and the experiences around tent living that might be relevant, I think relevant to a broader understanding of tent-based homelessness. So I'm going to sort of switch to thinking about sanctioned tents, which are clearly not the largest proportion of tents in our city. Okay, so I'm going to draw from data collected while Tent City 3 was at SPU. This is our loop, which is sort of the central part of our campus where Tent City lived for 3 months. I know UW has hosted twice, and so this is drawing on some of those kinds of experiences. So we hosted Tent City 3 times, once in 2012, again in 2015, and a third time in 2017, 2018. And so during all 3 of those visits, I worked with students, undergraduate students, and we interviewed 64 residents. For those of you who want to know the breakdown, in 2012, we interviewed 11. In 2015, it was 24. And in 2017, 2019, it was 29. So that's sort of the numbers through those 3 time periods. These were qualitative, semi-structured interviews to really get at people's pathways into homelessness, their lived experience, and why Tent City? Why not these unsanctioned tents? Why not some other, why not emergency shelters? What sort of brought them here and kept them there? So before we get into the heart of some of their stories, which I want to share a few with you, I just want to remind people about some of the features of sanctioned tent cities that are important, especially in comparison to all that data I just showed you about unsanctioned tents. So first is there has to be collaboration. You know this as you've hosted, UW has hosted. There's collaboration between the tent cities and their host sites. There's collaboration with nonprofits. In Tent Cities case with ShareWheel, there's collaboration with city governments because these are sanctioned. So there are charters and there are rules that have to be followed. In the case of Tent City 3, there's two important things to sort of make note of. One is there's a clear code of conduct for people who want to live there. They have to follow. And Tent City residents quite aptly just called them the rules. These are things you have to do. They include things like staying sober. They include things like doing so many community service and security patrols and hours. There's a clear level of involvement that is required to be a part of this tent city organization. And the other relatedly is self-governance. Before, remember, I mentioned the difference between no management, city management, nonprofit management, or self-management. Tent City 3 is an example of that self-management structure of what many residents really call the core values, the real core values. So why are people, for example, at Tent Cities or Tent City 3 especially versus other alternatives? And I think it's important to recognize the other alternatives are really streets and shelters. It's not permanent housing. It's not supportive housing. It's really, these are the two alternatives that residents talked to us about. And they saw both of these in different ways as unsafe and detrimental to their health and well-being. And this was before COVID. I mean, think about the ways in which that has even been exacerbated by the concerns around communal living and contracting a deadly virus. So why then are people at Tent City 3? And so one of the really powerful things that came across from residents was that it was a positive alternative. And I think in 5 domains, it was considered safe. So one of the residents told us, here I can keep both my eyes closed. And that was such a powerful image, because when you're on the street, you always have one eye open to make sure you're not being harmed or stolen from in some way. So think of the this exhaustion and the stress around not being able to sleep. And so one of the things they said, I can sleep here, I can rest my head. They also talked about, many of them were couples, and they said, if you're a couple, you're not a family in the shelter system. And so it became very important that they stay together. This was their support structure, and they didn't want to lose that. So that was important. Not unrelated. Many of them had pets. And there's lots of research that's been done about the importance of pets for people who are homeless, a sense of connection, someone to keep going for. They can be a very powerful source of connection and support. So that is also a reason why people went to Tent City 3. Another one that really struck me as I read through these and did these interviews was the way in which they talked about Tent City as helping them have ownership over their lives, over their space. They talked about their tent being their home and being a home base that then they could start to do other things. And one of those other things was work. That was also a really powerful theme that came across when residents talked about the ways in which they were able to work at Tent City 3 for a couple of reasons. The flexibility at hours that shelters don't have, that allowed you to go to work late and not miss your spot for that night, that you could leave your things there. One of our residents kept telling us, do you think you can go with a backpack and everything you own to a job interview? No, who's going to hire you? Right. So there was that piece that allowed them to work. And the third component of that, which I think is quite powerful, is residents told us about the culture of work that was supported at Tent City 3. If other people are working, we all know that it's easier to participate in those kinds of behaviors. If other people are getting up and going to work at 8 a.m. or 9 a.m., it's a lot easier to do so. And there was also flexibility about shifts that you had to participate in at Tent City 3 if you were working. And what we found, which surprised many of my students, was that almost 50% were working part-time or were seeking, or full-time, or seeking employment. So it was really over 50% that were tied to the labor market, which makes them kind of distinct. Let me tell you a little bit more about my sample. And I know, and so it's majority male, and it's a higher representation of men than we would expect in the general homeless population. So there's some ways in which residents at Tent City are a select group, not just of people who are homeless, but certainly of people who are living in tents. They're also more educated. They're also a little bit older, probably, with a mean age of 44. It's a racially diverse sample, but clearly not reflecting the numbers around racial and ethnic disproportionality around homelessness. So we sort of undercount that in Tent City 3, that they're not as well represented. Majority of them are divorced. Half of them have children. So in some ways they look like the broader homeless population, but in some ways they're very different, not just from other people living in tents, but from people who are homeless in general. So that's the last big theme I want to share with you, which is, what are the ways in which these residents who are living in a sanctioned tent encampment are different? And what are the ways in which they're similar from the broader population of homelessness? So this gets at the sort of the selection bias piece around people who are living in sanctioned tent cities. So one of the big takeaways around doing this research for with residents of Tent City is that their pathways are quite similar, despite some differences that I'll mention in a moment. Their pathways are really pretty similar to what we know from studies of homelessness and research more generally. And they're fourfold, really. They're economic, they're about family, they're about health, both physical and mental, and they're about, in some cases, about substance use and abuse. I think I have a couple minutes, so I'll just share with you a couple of stories that really reflect, I think, these different pathways. So I can give you an example of 3 different types of economic pathways into homelessness that we witnessed with Tent City 3 residents. One is the very straightforward job loss. This would be someone like Lance, who was working and going from contract to contract in tech and just had a bigger gap between contracts and couldn't get a long-term employment. But in the meantime was making good money. So had bought a condo and was spending money like the next contract would be around the corner. And then it's not, right? So then his condo is foreclosed and he goes into bankruptcy, and all of a sudden he's homeless, right? So very clear pathway from job loss in a way to homelessness. And you throw it at a recession and the difficulty of getting a new job in the mix, that makes it more complicated. So one is just very straightforward. Most people's cases were not straightforward. These pathways get interconnected, and we see the way economic factors are related to family or health or other issues. But 2 other economic pathways I want to share. One would be someone like Wade, who also had a job loss like Lance, but it really wasn't just the job loss that happened in the 2007 recession, where he lost his small trucking company. But when he lost his company, he also lost insurance. And then his daughter had a horrible accident and they lost everything, right? They didn't lose their daughter, which he continued to remind us. They lost their life savings. He lost his job, and he lost his identity and his ability to care for his family. And so he fell into a depression, and then he started to drink. And then he's divorced and he's homeless. So it is economic, but it's also tied up with all these other pieces. Or there's someone like Andy, who can work but can't continue with steady employment. So his homelessness comes in and out depending on whether or not he's employed. And it's his mental health. He's a Vietnam veteran, and it's his PTSD and his anxiety that come through, and he gets manic after a while of working in a job. And with untreated mental health issues, he then just quits, and then he's homeless. So those are some varied economic pathway stories. What about family? This is clearly gendered. More of the stories around the importance of family as a pathway came from women. One I'll share with you is from Candy, who really the first part of her experience with homelessness came from fleeing domestic violence, which is not an uncommon story for women. But she was able to sort of get back on the ground, and then she lost her house during Hurricane Katrina. Then the situation gets even worse, and she loses her daughter. Once again, health or loss of family members. And she sells everything that she owns to bury her daughter. And she said, I chose to be homeless because I had to make sure that my daughter was resting in peace. So is it economic? Yes. Is it also about lack of, about these family tragedies and the lack of sort of a safety net or support to kind of carry people in these challenging, troubling times? Then there are cases about health, physical health, mental health. Physical health story is a very straightforward one. Is someone like Jacob, who was living in Alaska, was fishing, and got hurt. And the owner of the company said, well, the insurance won't cover it because you were on the dock, not on the boat. So then he has tens of thousands of dollars of debt, and he's physically hurt still. And so he loses all of his money, all of his savings, and he's now homeless and is finding it harder to work because of his physical condition. Health. Last one being mental health. Lots of examples of this, but I'll think about one, which is the case of Jennifer. And she defies many of the expectations about becoming homeless, growing up in a solid upper middle class family, getting a PhD, very successful. And then both of her parents in a very short period of time die. She comes back to Seattle to take care of her dying mother. And when they're both gone, she's lost. She says that she spiraled into a depression that she couldn't get out of and just was lost. And that's how she found herself at Tent City 3. And the last example, substance abuse really came through often as a consequence of some other pathways. It was really very infrequently the driver, the sort of the primary pathway into homelessness. But if anyone, it was a little bit more primary, would be in the case of Tracy, where she talked about being a functional alcoholic for 15 years and working and being fine until she just moved to hard liquor, and it just changed the game. And she then couldn't keep down a job. And she recognized that she was using and drinking excessively to cover up a lot of family trauma, of which she shared with us, that got in the way of which was untreated trauma. And she used, like many, used substances to self-medicate for those challenges. So the pathways are very similar to what researchers have found. People living in shelters are similar in that way to those living outside and those living in tents. So I want you to see some similarities here. But I do want to identify at the end here some differences, because there are very different people who are living in these kind of sanctioned environments. One is there's definitely lower levels of drug and alcohol issues and of severe mental illness. Now, there's lower levels of drug and alcohol issues, partly because you can't be at Tent City 3 and be not sober. Now, many people I spoke with were struggling with sobriety. Sometimes that meant they had to leave for a few days because they were really struggling. So it's not to say it's not an issue, but it just wasn't the higher percentage like you might find in the chronically homeless population. Another difference, as I already alluded to, is they're much more tied to the labor market. Much more tied to the labor market in a way that was much more true in the 1980s. Snow and Anderson's classic book, Down on Their Luck, talk about the ways in which connections to the labor market were stronger, and they certainly stronger than they were decades later. We see it strong in this population, which bodes well for exit strategies. But that makes them different from a lot of the homeless population more broadly. Another big difference I want to identify here at the end is the ways in which people living in Tent City 3 talked about community. The community keeps us safe. We are connected to each other. We support each other. I stay here because of the community. In fact, some even told us they didn't want to leave because they had a sense of connection and community. And if they got an apartment or something somewhere, they'd be on their own. And they need the community to stay sober. They need the community to deal with some of the trauma that they've experienced in their lives. So social support and solidarity was an important theme. And lastly, I think that one of the differences is they talked about the ways in which they had a new identity of being roofless or houseless, not homeless, of having a tent, having a home, having a family. Some even use sort of the pseudo kinship structure to talk about their experiences in Tent City 3. Now, although I didn't talk to people living in unsanctioned tent encampments, it's pretty clear that there's some big differences between those who are in those unsanctioned and the ones that I spoke with living in these structured, self-managed kinds of environments like Tent City 3. So that's a little bit of an overview of two different tent-based homelessness stories. So what does all this sort of mean? Well, one thing I want to remember is that one of the reasons I did a tent census is because we need good data, right? If we want to do prevention and intervention, we really need to have solid data to help us to do that. That's true with these interviews as well. The complexity, the multifaceted pathways into homelessness is important for how we intervene if we want to do it successfully. So for unsanctioned tents, it's clear from my perspective that more outreach, housing first models are really appropriate. This is a population that is much more chronic and has many more of the mental health and substance abuse issues, unlike the Tent City 3 residents. For sanctioned tent communities, I think there needs to be more work to build on the strengths of communal living and the human and social capital that clearly many of these residents have and talked about as being fundamental and really important. So what's next? What's next for me is that I'm trying to put all this work on unsheltered homelessness together with my colleague here at SPU, Jennifer McKinney, on a book. And working with Chuck and Lindsay from the UW, from your neck of the woods, on a more extensive analysis of the tent census data, putting it together with crime data, with other kinds of social control data, with homelessness sweeps data, so that we can really look at the ways in which these different aspects are related or not related. I'm also contemplating an additional wave. I don't know, I haven't followed through on that. I'm thinking about it. Lastly, I just want to thank all of you for listening to me and for being present, and I look forward to your questions. But I would be remiss if I didn't thank my amazing students who I've been partnering with for almost 10 years now to do this kind of work. And of course, Tent City 3 residents who shared their stories and their tears. They were very wonderful and engaging in this process. I also received, this was really, both of these projects were done on a shoestring budget, literally. So I did receive a little money to help pay for student researchers from SPU. And the third wave would not have been possible without money from Finney Ridge Lutheran Church Endowment Fund. So I'm grateful to being able to piece together some small amounts of money to do this kind of work. So thank you for listening.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Karen. That was really fantastic. We've got a couple of questions in the Q&A section. I just wanted to start. I'll ask one of mine and then sort of summarize one of the longer questions to ask. So first of all, the spatial changes that you saw and the increase in the numbers of tents in each of these encampments between the census and the different waves, was that consistent across the sites, or is it possible that people, because of sweeps and things, were moving around the city?
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the biggest limitations here is how to try to figure out the displacement problem and how much was moving. And so I do think the work with Chuck and Lindsay is going to get at that, because we're going to also put in, putting together some of the homeless sweep data so that we can put it in chronological order. So we will be able to see, whether or not, we'll be able to infer whether or not there was a movement of tents based on a sweep. So yeah, that's, some of that is is coming, stay tuned. But I feel most confident in the lack of movement with the final wave because we did it in 2 weeks. Yes, I'm sure there is movement, but some of these structures they were pretty, they looked pretty permanent. So it wasn't, I don't think that many of them moved quickly, especially those larger ones. But some of the solitary tents, you're probably right. We could have counted twice, or some we might not have counted at all. So I don't have a great answer to figuring out how do I put a bounds on that, or what are the exact limits on either end of how much I overcounted or undercounted. So that's just a fundamental limitation.
Great, thank you. And then Nina's got a question about some of the policy implications and the fact that sort of there are, ways that people who are, living homeless are
Amy.
unable. Yes.
Amy,
Nina can ask it directly.
So she's unmuted, as well as Dan and Claudia and all the ones in the
Oh, great. Okay.
talk directly. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, great. So Nina, do you want to ask your question then?
Thank you, Amy. My question is, how can we use this data to prioritize the $20 billion in CARES Act funding that Biden released specifically towards people experiencing homelessness? I've been following the HCA in Washington and Department of Health data, and I can see that pots of money are going into shelter funding, health dollars, and Apple Medicaid, but none of those are directly outlined for people currently experiencing homelessness in Seattle or King County.
Yeah, great question, Nina. Thank you. As I'm not a policymaker, and they don't actually usually listen, they're not always listening to people who are doing research on these issues. It's a really big challenge. I have a little bit of, I'm a little bit encouraged though, because I have been talking to some people at the city who were intrigued when they saw this in the Seattle Times and said, we should talk about what you've done. And so I do think that the profile of showing how many tents there really are and how many people are in need of assistance, and because there is this influx of money coming in, that I am more hopeful. But I'd be happy to hear if there are particular ways that people think that I could be more strategic about making those connections, because I think you're absolutely right. This is a great opportunity with this COVID relief money to come in, and we have a clear need in our unsheltered population in the city. So I'd be happy to hear other people's insights about that as well.
My other question, I'm sorry, I just had multiple questions, was there's the quote unquote charity amendment to the proposed amendment to the Seattle Charter that makes unsheltered homelessness functionally criminal in Seattle city limits. And I'm wondering, again, how we can leverage this data. I mean, in community in North Seattle, most people have seen the article in the Seattle Times, and I was intrigued to see this webinar. I was under the impression in my brain that this was an update from that research, so I apologize. It was great to hear the research in more detail and your thoughts, so thank you so much for sharing that. I was just very curious because they seem to go a little bit hand in hand with this article coming out and then the Seattle Charter Amendment. That's all. Thank you so much.
Oh, that's an interesting insight. I have had no connection at all to the charter.
Of course not. That's not what I meant to.
No, I know, but you're right. The timing is sort of quite interesting. One of the reasons in this talk I wanted to share the stories, albeit from Tent City 3, was partially to give voice, even though I don't have stories from people living in the tents in my tent census, to sort of recognize the humanity and the complexity of some of these individuals' pathways into homelessness, to help us think about the prevention and intervention work in these ethical ways that I think that you're addressing. One of the things I have not done is given the data to the city of Seattle that have asked for the data. because I worry about how it might be used. So I do have those concerns. So thank you, Nina.
Great. And yes, thank you. And we've only got about 5 minutes left, so let's try to get through as many questions as we can. I know Dan's got a question, and then after Dan, we'll go to Claudia, and then we'll move our way through the list.
Hello, thank you for the work and the cool talk. So my first question kind of follows up on the previous one, which is this idea of people getting a lot of community support seems really important. I've heard this in media presentation as well. Have you heard of any models to take advantage of this in trying to rehouse people and help people to get into more stable situations?
That's a good question. And please chime in, Dan, if I'm misinterpreting your question. One of the things that I think can be leveraged, particularly in what we learned from Tent City 3, is to have to potentially even think about moving groups of people to similar housing facilities at similar times, or to particularly have things like tenant associations within some of these supportive housing, so people have some agency, some voice, some role in the ways in which the housing that they're living in is organized and is supported. So I do think that particularly for people living in sanctioned tents, we can leverage some of those community building relationships in ways that moving people together and also building into permanent or supportive housing some of these elements. People want to have voice, they want to have agency in how in their lives, and so I think that could be used. But in terms of the unsanctioned tents, I don't have any sense of whether or not that is as pro-social in the way that it clearly was in the case of Tent City 3. But yeah, I think that we should do that. I don't know any that are doing that. So you asked for models. I don't know that any are specifically doing that, but I do think there could be much more outreach and positive case management support in sanctioned tent encampments. They didn't have that. And so there are people who are pretty close to being able to get ready to exit homelessness, but they just need a little bit more assistance. But that wasn't part of the city relationship. And I would love to see more outreach go to those sanctioned tent encampments, because people are much more housing ready, if you will, the old way of doing things. So we can use those resources for housing first for those that are in tents, that are chronically homeless, that really need that kind of a model.
Great, thank you. And Claudia, I think you are next up.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, okay, great. So I'm Claudia Gross-Shader. I work for the City of Seattle in the Office of City Auditor, and I appreciate Karen's invitation to join today. And I guess my question just boils down to, how can we bridge more opportunities to connect researchers and practitioners in this area?
Claudia, great question. I mean, thankfully you and I are connected, which is a hopeful sign, but it's the research practice gap that has always plagued the Academy. And I think also plagued the city there. I tried several years ago to put together with members from the UW and from Seattle, different researchers on homelessness. And we did hold some events and trying to create a space where researchers, practitioners, and government officials were working together. And frankly, it was exhausting and didn't really go anywhere. And so I think it really has to come from the city. I think this city has a structure, has more resources to sort of bridge some sort of collaboration with researchers. How that's not part of the regional response to homelessness, I mean, that could easily be part of this new way of thinking about homelessness regionally. Let's also think about broadening the expertise from people who are experiencing homelessness to practitioners, to politicians, and to academics. I mean, I would love to see some sort of way in which that would be incorporated in the board or in the next mayor's representation.
Great, thank you. And I think we have time, one more question, maybe. William, it looks like you are next in the queue.
Yeah, I was just wondering if there were any migrant folks that were sampled who identified as migrant.
Great question. And I'm sure there, I mean, I don't know for sure. I would imagine there would be in the unsanctioned, the tent census, but I didn't talk to individual people because I was looking at tents. So I don't know. And I wish that would have been a second project, really, to go back and talk to people and get some of that information. No one, as I can recall, and I'm still working on this 64, these interviews, but I don't recall anyone specifically mentioning that status. And that might partially also be because of the timing of when I did these, when I collected this data. We might find if the timing was closer to some of the other broader issues about migration, it might have been better captured. But it's also that Tent City 3 is this kind of select group, and I think it might be harder for migrants to get to become aware or to become involved and to be able to stay at a place like Tent City. I think there's what some people probably talk about is some gatekeeping that probably happens around getting into those places. And so people who are new and are recent migrants, it might be much harder for them to find those places. So great question. I want someone to do that research on tents and migration, because I don't know the answer, but thank you for the question.
Yeah, no, and thank you. Hey, yeah, future projects.
Right, so we've got an anonymous attendee dropped in. Did you determine the average length of stay by person in the sanctioned tent? And then I think Susie is next. We've got 1 minute.
Okay, great question. No, I did not do the length of stay, but we could look at the 3 different waves and look at the pictures to see if these are the same tents. We could do some way of seeing if the same tent was in all 3 of those places. We didn't do it. We just went at one moment in time. So I don't have that sort of time specific, tent specific location data. Great question though. What was the other one, Amy?
I think it's up for Susie.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. That was really wonderful. I was wondering if you could speak more to your finding about how people in the sanctioned encampment had stronger labor market ties. And I was wondering, you mentioned the culture of work within the camp. And I was wondering if this was probably a selection effect, that people with stronger ties already came into the camp, or whether they might have taken up work once they were in that environment.
Oh, really good question. I think it's more the former, that they were already more connected. So it's a selection bias piece. I think you're absolutely right. But it could have easily dropped off if it weren't for the environment of Tent City 3. So I think it has that interactive effect, that culture of work, that they came in with stronger labor market ties, but those were reinforced, if you will, through time living in that environment. But you're absolutely correct. I think it is a selection bias that we don't find, as somebody put in the chat, at Tent City 4, and we don't find among people who are the researchers that have done work on those in unsanctioned tents. We don't find that same connection. So there is something very unique, which is why I think it's a lot easier to intervene and help that population very quickly exit, and it won't be as costly. And so then we can really put a lot more of the housing and the substance abuse and the mental health and the other kinds of education or labor market resources to those who are in these unsanctioned tents.
Thank you.
Great. Let's see. So we have one last question that's waiting. I don't know if folks have time for that, or if we should wrap it, or I think it's Mike.
Hello. Oh, did we have time to ask a question?
Karen, do you have time for one more?
Sure, absolutely.
Oh, that's great. Okay. So I just wanted to mention there's about I think I've got like 46 that I've tracked mutual aid groups in the community that are doing outreach just as individual organized efforts from communities. They're not the official top down type approaches, but they're all uncoordinated and they're all trying to help. And I'm wondering if you've done, if you've spoken to any of those groups about this information. I know that there's a couple groups that are trying to create a real-time like map within all the parks in Seattle of all these encampments. And I know that we've collected a lot of data ourselves in my organization on the sweeps and whether or not people are being displaced or put into shelters and where they're going. So I'm just curious as to if you've spoken to any of those groups.
Great question. Thank you for asking. I have not, but I'm not opposed to it. And it would be a very interesting conversation to think about, going back to Claudia's question before, how do we do this collaboration across these different entities that are working in some ways with these similar goals of getting people housed and reducing homelessness in our city. So my information, if anybody has questions or has opportunities to engage or collaborate, please just send me an email. I'd be happy to talk further. And it's just snedker@spu.edu. So please, if there's a particular organization that you work for that you want to have a conversation, I would very much enjoy that.
Okay, thank you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Karen. I don't know if Maria or Sarah have final parting words.
Just more thank yous. Thank you so much, Karen. That was amazing. And
It was really fun. Thank you all. I really appreciate an opportunity to share about my research. So thanks.
it was wonderful. Very, very interesting. And thanks to Amy, of course. And nice to see her again.
Yeah, good to see you too. Thanks.
Okay, so take care, everyone. Thanks to the audience as well.
Thank you.
Right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.